what happens? There was that time you said like we had a bit of a refeed, and then I end up like I think I end up dropping weight, even though we added like I don't know 400 grams of extra carbs into the diet. So yeah, so there's obviously it's counterintuitive, calories up, weight down.
Right. Yeah.
What's happening there?
Logically, it doesn't sound like it makes sense, but this comes back to metabolism is dynamic. That I never usually give someone a one-day refeed. It's always multiple days in a row, because what we often find, depending on the size of the athlete, some athletes we can get glycogen saturation within 12 to 24 hours. Some people it takes 96 hours with, and that's dependent on a variety of different factors, including, the genetics of that athlete, the muscle within their frame itself, the stimulus, environmental stimulus and whatnot. When we're looking at refeeding, if we're talking about, like a strength-based athlete, someone with a decent whack on their frame, within that first 12 to 24 hours, we're only seeing a change in that metabolic response. So think about it back to when I was talking about the Krebs cycle, TCA cycle being the center of your metabolic universe. We're feeding into that. So that machinery has slowed down and turned down, which has slowed down a whole heap of other metabolic processes. So with metabolism, when you're in an energy deficit, a long-term chronic energy deficit, your body essentially says, we're only going to prioritize the metabolic processes that are responsible for immediate survival. Everything else outside of that, we're going to slow down a little bit because it's not that important. So things like, for example, if there's not enough food in your environment, the priority of making offspring is not that great. So hormone production will dampen natural hormone production. So think about in regards to a strength-based athlete, how important things like your hormones are in regards to recovery and growth. They contribute something massively. It's why we have, like a lot of exogenous hormone supplementation in order to modify these things. If we're having a natural decrease in that process because your body says, oh, there's not enough food in my environment to survive, it's probably not a good idea to make babies because we're just going to have to feed them as well. So your hormones will start to decrease. And people will often see this as a symptomatic response. It's really easy in women to see because they will get stuff like a loss of menses. Yep. In men, it's not as simple because you don't get this really inconvenient monthly cycle that shows whether or not your hormones has decreased. It usually results in things like your sex drive has changed. So women see this as well, but sex drive is something that, has a lot of environmental impacts to it as well. So your interest in sex will change through bulking. Men will probably feel like it's of high interest through the back end of a diet. They'll often say, it's not even in any context of my mind, I'm just too tired, which is personality-wise probably not normal for them. This is, a generalization. But when we're looking at reverse dieting, natural hormones decrease. This is just one metabolic process, for example. Within that first sort of refeed, you start seeing a change in stuff like that. So it's almost instantaneous with men. Within a couple of days, they're like, my sex drive is back, or my sex drive has changed heaps within that first couple of days. When we're looking at carbohydrate refeeding, it's not as simple as going, oh, we're getting more carbs, we're going to put it straight into the muscle. It's going to start feeding into those metabolic processes such as hormone production that have suppressed over time. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Right, so it's not all of that energy that's accounted for with the general calorific equation isn't going to all the normal places it would, which is why you're seeing a net loss. Yeah. Right, okay.
Why we're seeing a net loss. There is also another factor.
Because the Krebs cycle and those cycles are working harder.
Correct. There is also another factor that happens because you've been in an energy deficit. The metabolic enzymes throughout that Krebs cycle, for example, have upregulated because there's been less carbohydrate. So it needs to be more efficient at doing that. So that when you reintroduce those carbohydrates, you've got basically increase metabolic machinery efficiency. So things will run through and churn through really, really quickly. Another thing that happens as well, when you've been in an energy deficit, I talked earlier on before about you get really tired and you get all these little thoughts in your head saying, stop working so hard. Oh, this is hard. Everything's tired. You start to get a little bit of extra food, and everyone's done this. What happens when you give lollies to a small child? They go nuts. Carbohydrates, when you've been in a carbohydrate deficit environment, it creates a sort of neurological response where it sends a pulse to your brain that says, we've got high performance fuels coming. When we've previously had all this feedback to our brain that has said, we don't have a lot of fuel available. So if you're suddenly getting all these messages to your brain that said, you've got more fuel, you can work harder, people inadvertently end up burning more energy because they're moving around a hell of a lot more, because they're like, oh, I've got all this energy. I'm going to go wash the car. I'm going to vacuum the house. I'm going to do all this washing that's been building up for the last 3 weeks because I've just not wanted to deal with that and I'm too tired.
Those